That's a question people usually ask, right? Where did the P-47 come from, right? How was the choice of this weapon made?
Someone asked this here. Look, someone asked this here. I'd like Vicente to tell us why the P-47 was chosen as the equipment for the Brazilian Air Force in Italy. So,
There's a gray area there about why the P-47 was chosen, okay? No, I'm not going to say there isn't. I'm not aware of any document that states the reason, whether it's a letter, an official document, the reason why the P-47 was chosen. Now, the question people usually ask is, but the P-47 was chosen because of the group's mission, right? When the group got there, there was no more Luftwaffe, there was barely any Italian aviation, so they started doing dive bombing, and the P-47 wasn't the best aircraft for that. It wasn't the most suitable for it. The answer is no, it wasn't because of that, for a very simple reason. The fighter group left here, what's it called? The key men left in January 3rd and 4th of 44, if I'm not mistaken, to Orlando. Then, from February until April, May, the groups left for Panama, right? And in March of 44, there's already a document requesting 68 Republic P-47 aircraft from the Americans. There's already a formal request. That was in March of 44. What happens? The fighter group, it was sent to Italy. Actually, at first, it wasn't supposed to go to Italy. It was supposed to go to North Africa, okay? The original destination of the fighter group was Talergma, which is in Algeria. Where were they originally supposed to go, and where would they operate? Yes, together with the Allied Coastal Air Force, right? The Mediterranean Coastal Air Force, which was responsible for the defense of North Africa, southern Italy, Sicily, Corsica, and also for protecting the convoys that crossed the Mediterranean, right? Since that was their role, all the training they did in Orlando and Panama, and later the transition to the P-47 in Suffolk, was focused on aerial combat. Okay? So when you say that the fighter group received the P-47 because the mission was dive bombing and the P-47 had already been ordered in March, what are you really saying? The guys trained all wrong, that their mission was going to be dive bombing and they trained for aerial combat instead. That doesn't make any sense at all, you know? And then we have documents. Yeah, I have a copy, yeah. Unfortunately, I didn't remember to separate this specific one from Vanderlee, his report, where he talks about it. Yeah, a week before Colombi's ship arrived in Italy, and it was going to dock at the port of Naples. The fighter group was already headed to Pomigliano instead of Africa. Yeah, they changed the group's destination to Livorno and then to Tarquinia, and they found out that the fighter group wasn't going to do air defense anymore. Even back then, there was talk about air defense in the Naples region, that it was going to be changed to a dive bombing mission, to tactical bombing, right? So much so that they left, they got out from under the umbrella of the Mediterranean Coastal Air Force and moved under the umbrella of the 12th Air Force under Tidlow. Okay? More specifically, under the 22nd Tactical War Command, right? Because at the time when they first arrived, it was Tidlow, and later it became Thomas Darcy, right? So they left that role, so it doesn't make any sense to say that the P-47 was bought for that purpose. So hypothetically, what I think is most likely is that it had already been decided which group the fighter group would be flying with. And if you're going to fly with an American unit, the unit won't fly there with, you won't have the P-51 and you with the P-47, the guys with the P-39 and you with the P-40, you know. If you're in the same fighter group, the whole fighter group has the same equipment. So what makes sense is that if I had an idea, it's like this, I'm just using logic, okay? I won't make a final decision or jump to conclusions, but based on what I know, this makes sense. Remember that Manderley's document even says the group's training should be done as follows. In P-40, if the chosen aircraft was the P-47 or the P-51, or in P-39 if the chosen aircraft was the P-63. Hold that thought. So if you look at the end of 40 and at the end of 40, the P-350 was still there in the Corsica region in North Africa, flying the P-39. Did you get it? In fact, the fighter group, the P-350, in which Sentapua flew together, they only switched to the P-47 there between August and September of 44. That's what happened.
Was there a period when they used both? Did they use the P-47 and the P-39?
They did because, well, no, the planes weren't replaced all at once. That's why I say from August to September, because the planes weren't swapped out all at once. They were being replaced gradually. They started removing the P-39s. And something that not many people know is this. They flew both the P-39 and the P-47. Like when they were defending, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Corsica or North Africa, besides the P-39, each squadron received 2 P-38s to intercept high-altitude Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft. So what makes sense to me is this. You choose the airplane not based on the mission, but based on the group it will fly with, because you need to have some commonality, right? Even in terms of mechanics, equipment, and so on.
Yes. And then I think it's also worth adding that at that time, right there in the Mediterranean, this was already taking shape. In fact, it had already been established. Actually, I'm saying that at the time the group was created, the division between tactical and strategic responsibilities had already become established. Right, because the 15th Air Force, which is strategic, was created on November 1st, 1943. Created.
The first commander, if I'm not mistaken, was Little, right?
It was Little. And then it went to Nathan Twining right after, because Little went on to take command of the 8th over in England.
Over in England?
Yeah. So, since there was already this duality here, look, these people here fly strategic missions. These people here fly tactical missions. If you insert Sentapua, if you insert the Brazilian fighter group into the 15th Air Force, you're essentially saying that these people will have to escort planes into Germany. Isn't that right? Because that's the only way for a Brazilian to be able to fly a Mustang, right? The Mustang is an air superiority aircraft. It's a combat aircraft. It's a long-range aircraft for bomber escorting bombing missions and long-range fighter patrols. It's not a tactical mission. It's not for attacking ground targets. The Mustang doesn't have the endurance of the P-47, the robustness of the P-47, or the firepower of the P-47 to keep attacking. Positions, armored positions, right? Heavily defended ground positions. You even see the Mustang doing strafing airfields and things like that, but attacking defended positions, that's really more for the P-47, right?
Remember, the P-47 didn't originally have that role when it started out. The P-47, it started out as a fighter plane, okay? Yeah, in the literal sense of the word. And then its toughness is what started to show it was suitable for that, right? So much so that the first planes the fighter group had, because our P-47s didn't all arrive in Italy at once, right? So the P-47 started to arrive actually, if I remember correctly, it was in June of 44 that the first ones started arriving at the depot in Naples, right? And they were the D-25, 27, 28 models, which didn't even have dive brakes.
Okay, right.
They didn't have it. They still weren't the fully adapted version, fully adapted for this type of mission. Only the D-30s with the D-30, which had dive brakes installed to slow down, because the Thunderbolt in a dive. In fact, the first P-47s had a problem, which was recovering from a dive, which was quite complicated. In fact, in the first models, in the B, the tail surfaces, they were made of fabric, and the pressure was so great that they would tear apart. And then the guy, obviously, right, would crash with the plane, and later they were replaced with metal ones to withstand the pressure, you know? So this dive brake had to be installed for this mission, because the 25, 27, 28, they were a bit more complicated, since there was no other way to control their speed, right? So in the beginning, they were fighters. They weren't really. And here, I'll admit that I don't know. In March of 44, it was already decided, but there still wasn't this, I don't know if there was already this, how do you say? The virtue of the P-47 had already been established as it's going to be used mainly for this, you know?
I believe in the 8th, right? Because the 9th Air Force, it will be transferred to England at the same time that the 15th is created. The 9th, it goes in September, October to England. The 9th is in the Middle East, right? The 9th is in Egypt. At that time, that distinction between tactical and strategic air forces didn't exist yet.
And yes,
It was at that time, at the end of 43, that the command was created, the command of the strategic air forces, to coordinate the bombing offensive under a single authority, which was Karl Spaatz. So the 9th will be diverted from Egypt to England. It will leave its planes with the 12th. The 12th, suddenly it grows, it gets huge. It gets B-17S, it gets B-24S, it gets everything. But then in November, the 15th is created. And then immediately the 12th has to transfer those heavy units, the B-24S, B-17S, and even B-26S to the 15th. It keeps only the B-25S. B-25S and the lighter planes, the P-47 and the remaining P-39s. So over there in England by that time, in 43, you already have the P-47 as the only real escort aircraft. Right? Yeah, except for the P-38, but the only single-engine aircraft. So I believe the P-47 at that time in 43 had already had some experience attacking targets.
now, about not sending the fighter squadron to the other theater there, wherever it was, but for example, you mentioned England, etc. With the 15th flying the P-51, isn't there something else too? You don't send an inexperienced unit, a unit that's still not very experienced in combat, right? Just recently trained straight into, pardon my language, straight into the thick of it, right?
You don't.
Exactly. So the reason for sending the fighter group to Italy also has to do with that, and that's not a bad thing at all. On the contrary, okay? Yeah, it's part of the deal, right? If you look at the 350th documents, and I have several of them here, it clearly says that the first missions of the fighter group would be in less defended areas with bigger targets. As things progress, they move on to more heavily defended areas and smaller targets, where you even need to get closer, and so on.
Exactly. It's the same practice that the FEB went through as well. They started out in the secondary sector.
I think what it has to do with is sending them to Italy and flying the P-47 has more to do, I think, with this situation, right? Of sending them to an area that matched what that force was at that moment, right? It's not that it's possible. And another thing, right? What few people also remember is this, right? Yeah, even so, Vasquez, there was no Luftwaffe there. Things were calmer there. On the contrary, man, they got the worst mission there is, which is the dive bombing mission. Actually, it ended up being much worse because when you go into dive bombing, you have a predictable trajectory, you become a much easier target, you take flak from the ground. When you're in aerial combat, in a way, unless there's a huge difference in equipment and training, right? But theoretically, you're on equal footing with your enemy, you know?
Exactly.
So there's this little detail, right?